Hi, I'm Janie Gruner. I'm a second year, formerly Section B, and I'll be working with Trent today. We're doing a case from the Keenan Flagler casebook from this year, 2015.
Perfect. Yeah, Trent Murphey, class of 2016. Excited to help today.
Sounds good. All right, Trent. So today our client that we're going to be talking about is Christie's Bakery. Christie's is a regional bakery chain on the West Coast, and they pride themselves on their in-house baked goods. So unlike many chain bakeries, they make their goods at each location instead of at a central location and then distributing to their locations. So this does raise the price point of Christie's goods, but Christie's customers really appreciate the quality and the freshness of Christie's products. So lately, the company has been pretty pleased with their financial performance, and they would like to continue to increase the number of bakeries they operate. But the board thinks that the multi-site baking process is leading to operational inefficiencies when compared to their counterpoints. So today, what we're mainly going to be looking at is looking at their current model and whether or not that's sustainable, or if they should switch to a hub and spoke model as they look into future growth.
Okay. So just in thinking about this right now, I want to make sure I got this right. So
Sure.
Right now we're operating regionally. It's our client's Christie's Bakery, and they currently make all of their baked goods on site.
Yep.
And we're trying to determine whether or not they should switch to a hub and spoke model. Is that correct? Okay.
Yep.
Are there any non-financial considerations that we need to think about with this?
No, so I mean they are looking at expanding their locations over the next few years, so their primary consideration is whether they should switch with baking at each individual location or move into this other model.
Okay, and do we have any idea in terms of what that growth is going to look like?
So they are looking to double their number of stores over the next 10 years.
And do we know how many stores they have right now?
Yeah, we can get into that as we get in further into the case.
Okay, and right now you said only West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know where that expansion is going to be?
So it's a little bit, they're still figuring that out. Probably still West Coast, but exact locations are unknown.
Okay, do you mind giving me a few minutes while I think about this?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm just going to kind of walk you through this and write some more as I go. So
Sure.
when I'm thinking about this, what I really want to understand is the cost savings that we're going to have as a result of the hub and spoke model,
Mm-hmm.
and think about that cost savings on an annual basis, and then look at the expenses that we're going to have. We're going to have expenses, I'm assuming, that are both one time and then ones that are ongoing.
Okay.
And what we kind of need to do is we need to understand whether or not that cost savings is going to be enough to merit the expenses. Do we have any information in terms of what the payback period is on this? I should have asked that earlier, but
No, I mean, we would like to actually find that out. That's one of the client's considerations.
Okay.
So we do have some more detailed financial data, and we can try and figure out what that payback period would look like.
okay. Is there a hurdle rate that this company has?
No.
Okay, so we'll just look at that. In addition to these, the financial implications, I also want to understand the non-financial. You mentioned that
Okay.
You know, they currently, their customers really like the quality that they get and also the freshness. And I think that may be a core part of their brand in general, and so I really want to understand that.
Okay.
In addition to that, I want to think about all of these cost savings, and not just in their current situation, but also kind of understand them versus future state.
Okay.
Because it's important to not only think about the savings that they're going to have now, but also given the growth plans that they have.
Sure.
So I'd love to start out and really begin looking at both the expenses that we're going to have in terms of CapEx, and then the cost savings and ongoing expenses that we're going to have.
Sure.
All right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Before we get to that, which I think is a great place to go, we wanted to just take a little bit of a closer look at what do you think are some of the benefits or some of the disadvantages of the way they're doing it now versus the proposed system.
Okay.
Which you've covered a lot here, but just wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive just into that question first.
So you said we want to talk about advantages and disadvantages.
Of the current system versus this proposed hub and spoke model.
Advantages and disadvantages, and I'm thinking you said current, and then the proposed, is that correct?
Yep.
And also in thinking about this, I kind of actually am going to have some subcategories here, because I think that there are going to be some financial and some non-financial as well.
Makes sense.
And so we're going to have each of those, so financial and non for each of these. So really what I want to do is I want to kind of brainstorm some of these and see whether or not we can, think of what these would be. So current system right now, financially, advantages. There actually are probably not a ton of advantages financially, but from
Why
a
do
non,
you say that?
just we already kind of talked about higher costs associated with this. We talked about the fact that you have labor in each store, and so you can't really flex that as well for demand. We're not going to be able to have economies in terms of buying and purchasing. So I'm assuming that there's not a lot of financial advantages at this point. The one thing that I think we could maybe say is due to the fact that we are fresh, we may be able to have a higher price point as a result of that. So that's not on the cost side, but that is on the revenue side. So we can push some of those costs on the customers. So
Fair enough.
So that's always a good thing. And then when we're thinking about the non-financial advantages, I think we kind of discussed some of them. So we're going to have freshness. We're going to have better quality. We're going to, I think, maybe have fewer out of stock.
Okay.
Because
kind of customize a little bit.
Yeah, we can do it, and we can really understand, if the customers are buying a lot of, muffins or donuts that day, we can just make more.
Yep.
So having that in-house gives us some responsiveness that we wouldn't necessarily have given a hub and spoke model. So some disadvantages, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but we're not going to be able to flex as much in terms of our workforce. We're going to have more fixed costs. We're not going to have economies of scale that we would have in terms of purchasing, so that's going to be from a product side of things, or materials, or what, I don't know, ingredients probably, baking, right? That's what we call them. Yeah. So we may have higher labor costs given the fact that we are operating in cities, and so we're going to have to pay people more to actually keep them. So higher labor costs. So I think those are some of the ones that I'm thinking about. Thinking about from a non-financial perspective, disadvantages associated with this, there aren't as many, I guess, non-financial disadvantages. Perhaps we're going to, not be able to produce as broad a range of products, because we aren't going to be able to have the capabilities in every single store.
Maybe like consistency.
That's good as well. So consistency, we have to have quality bakers in every single store, whereas if we had a central location, we would have quality overall. So yeah, that's good. So looking at the proposed model right here, some of the advantages, the financial advantages, that's where we're going to have a lot, and we kind of discussed that a little bit. So labor savings, economies of scale. It's kind of interesting. You can almost just pair those right here.
Yeah, so. I think a lot of them, as you said, are going to kind of be complementary. So feel free to go through, but we can.
Yeah, I think we're hitting most of those. We've already hit most of them. Thinking of non-financial advantages, we we'll have that consistency, have that quality. It's like the exact
Yeah.
same thing. So we're not going to belabor the point, and I think I've hit on a lot of them.
Yeah.
So what I'd love to do now is kind of get into, understanding the advantages and disadvantages that we currently have. I want to understand what these financial savings are going to be, and if they are worth the giving up these non-financial advantages that we're currently going to have.
I think that's a perfect place to go. So we do have some information and on our current operations. This does not include any expansion. And the client's basically wondering if they switch to this hub and spoke model, what the financial impacts would be.
Okay. So I am just looking at these right now, and I want to kind of understand what they mean. Can I write on this? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So it looks like we have distances from hubs. So Portland, there's 0. So it says right here that the hub is located in Portland. So that makes sense that they're all going to be there. It looks like Seattle is 180 miles from Oregon, and I'm assuming we're not going to make 3 separate trips. Is that correct?
No, you can assume that we would make one trip and hit those Seattle locations.
Okay, and in order to maintain freshness, it looks like we're having 2 trips per week, which that's going to be important to understand. So we're going to drive this 180 miles from Portland to Seattle twice.
Yep.
It looks like Tacoma's on the way. Are we going to be able to do that in one trip as well?
Yeah, so you can assume that we would
just go there
exactly
and back and go
so
through
it'd be
Tacoma.
Considered one trip where we could make those stops.
So all of our Washington locations are going to be 180 miles total round trip in order to get there.
Correct.
And assume that the distance between stores is negligible. Is that okay?
Yeah, so you can assume that Tacoma's not out of the way at all.
Okay.
It's just
right on I-5. Perfect.
Yep.
I'm actually from Washington, so I can speak to this, so that's good. Okay, so then talking about Oregon, we're going to deliver all of these 0 miles, and then we're going to go through Salem, through Corvallis to Eugene, and then back up. So in order to deliver to our 6 stores, we're only going to have to go 100 miles.
Yep.
Is that correct? Okay, and these are one way, so that means that it's going to be 200 miles round trip. So this equals, and I'm just going to kind of use a separate sheet of paper if that's okay. So I just want to make sure that I understand how much this is going to cost us to actually run the hub and spoke model. So what we're going to have right here is Washington and then Oregon, and I want to make sure we have the distances. So we have 180 miles, so this is one way. 180 and then 100, which means round trip we're going to have 360 and we're going to have 200 miles, right? And so what we need to understand is how much this is going to cost per trip, and it looks like right here the mileage cost is 50 cents per mile.
Right.
So that means that right here for each trip, so on a trip, this is going to be $180, and each trip here is going to be $100. And then we need to figure out how many trips that we're going to be doing in a year, because I want this on an annual basis.
Yep.
So annual trips, it looks like we have, let's see, 2 per week. Do we know, is it all right if I assume 50 weeks in a year?
That's fine.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so 50 weeks in a year, that means we're going to have 100 annual trips. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to multiply these together, and this is going to add to 0. So we're going to get $18,000 per year to do the Washington deliveries, and Oregon's just going to be $10,000. So combined for deliveries, we're going to have $28,000 per year, and this is going to be all variable costs.
Okay.
So these are the variable costs of doing the delivery. We also need to look at labor costs, which sometimes is debatable whether it's fixed or variable, but I'm going to just call that a fixed cost because we're going to have their salaries, and it looks like it's $100 or $600,000 per year per driver.
Yeah.
And it says that we have 2 drivers, so that means that our fixed costs are going to be $120,000 because they just multiply that $60,000 by 2.
Yep.
And so our total annual costs look like they're going to be approximately $148. That's, let's just say approximately $150,000 per year in costs. And these are all the incremental costs associated with this. So I'm assuming there's going to be some costs associated with actually running the new bakery, the factory that we're doing. Are those anywhere here?
Yeah, so they're not broken broken out directly. What we do have is this savings on an annual basis, and that would be basically if we were to add up all the way we're in this new model and weigh it against what we're currently spending, you'd see this in savings.
Okay, so this is going to be incremental cost savings associated with running the factory or the new big bakery. So what that means is this was additional cost, but then we have to take away the cost savings that we're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And so the cost savings were 300. And so that means that we're going to have approximately $150,000 in cost savings annually.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to figure out payback, we need to figure out what we're weighing that against. And it looks like our capital expenditure here is going to be $900,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess there's also vehicle costs, and we have $40,000 in vehicle costs, and we're going to have 2 vehicles.
Yep.
So that means that that's going to be $980,000 in terms of fixed costs, or not fixed costs, but in terms of capital expenditure, just to get this thing going.
Yep.
Upfront investment, yeah. So that's gonna be $980,000, and in order to do payback, we just need to divide that by $150,000,
Okay.
and it goes into 6 times 8, so we're gonna say about 6.5 years.
That's great.
In order to be able to pay back this, given the savings that this is going to give us. So when thinking about that right now, the hub and spoke model is somewhat financially attractive given our current model, but we also understand that we're going to be growing. And so I really want to understand whether or not that growth is going to be within this I-5 corridor, or whether it's going to be beyond that. Do we have any data about that?
So we don't have any specifics. Kind of based on what you've thought about so far, and based on kind of the benefits and disadvantages of this system, not knowing specifically where we're going to expand, but certainly the client would want to consider that. What do you think? What recommendation would you make to this client?
Do you mind giving me a second?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to recommend is that we actually shift to this hub and spoke model. Given the current state that we're in, it's going to be a 6.5 year payback, but I think that could actually improve if we open stores within the same market that we're currently in.
Okay.
So it gives us that future optionality, which is something that I really like. Also, perhaps if we expand outside of this corridor and we do like San Francisco or Oakland, we're going to be able to, really kill that market in terms of having this skill already. And so it gives us that competency that's going to open things up for us.
Great.
The risks are that we could perhaps lose customers because they really like our current model and like the freshness that we're able to deliver.
Right.
And like I said, we could have some more out of stocks, but we will be developing a new operational skill that will give us, I think, some expansion opportunity, and perhaps will give us the opportunity to franchise this in the future if that was an option. The next steps are really to understand where we're going to be expanding to know whether or not this truly makes sense. So that's something that I want to look at and do some more research on. But given what we know right now, I think it's a good proposition for us.
Sounds good.
So I think like one thing that I would have done better has been a little bit more specific to this problem. Like when I wrote down, some of the economies of scale, bigger batches, like I probably would have wrote like flour savings or sugar savings, whatever those things are that are specific to a bakery, and actually try to put myself in the shoes of Christie's bakery and not just be as broad as what I did. So.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think it was bad in that regard, because while we were talking about it, we were always talking about the specific client at hand, but even just on a general note, I think it's always good to bring in like, if it were me, I'd have been like, I love bakeries, I love doing good.
Look at me, I love bakeries.
If you can say anything to relate to the case, it just kind of lightens the mood with your interviewer.
Yeah.
So.
And that's what I try to do with the I-5 thing, because it was
exactly.
from Washington. So
Yeah.
So I mean, I didn't think that this was honestly the strongest framework that I'd ever done, but I when I get a little frustrated sometimes, I know I actually learn by speaking, so I actually just started and like talked through and walked through it.
That was great too, when you mentioned that you had written some stuff down and you were going to keep writing, but you were ready to kind of talk through it. I think that's a great way to go, because sometimes if you pause for too long, it can get a little bit awkward, but you've thought about it enough that you're ready to kind of start the conversation. So.
Yeah, and honestly, like, it's different for every person, but for me, I actually sometimes don't even take time because I'm a talker, I'm a learner by speaking, and so I'd actually write and talk the whole way, but sometimes it can screw you up if you don't know where you're going a little bit. So.
Yeah, exactly. The next part was the brainstorming. So again, as an interviewer, I thought this was great. It was very, from the beginning, the way you laid it out was very easy for me to follow. You weren't just like listing things off. It was you were very deliberate about where you were going to put them and how they related to the two different systems that we were looking at. So I thought, great job. And then as you kind of got into the second half, you realized that a lot of these things were kind of already covered and were just the opposite of what we had already talked about. But great job with kind of breaking down the brainstorm. I think it helps you think of more ideas as you're doing it, because you can categorize them and just help out your interviewer with kind of knowing where you're going. Yeah.
I always think I can put a couple things in each bucket, so if I have buckets, that's helpful. If I were to redo this, I probably would have just had advantages, disadvantages, and then cross this out and put financial here and non-financial down here, because it got really redundant, honestly. One thing is, oftentimes I don't know where I'm starting. I don't know where to go from the beginning, and so I don't know how to create the buckets. But if I brainstorm a couple things, I can then bucket after brainstorming. I'll be like, oh, these are all actually fixed costs, and these are all actually variable costs, and so I should have done But go through and do that. I always think it's helpful to have a few generic buckets that you can use. So for me, advantages, disadvantages, financial, non-financial, pros, cons. Oftentimes I do short-term, long-term, or fixed, variable. Those things are things that help me, that are very generic, just kind of broadly bucket items.
Yep.
So
yeah, and I think what you said, I mean, at the start of any brainstorming session, you're probably not going to know the perfect way to bucket it, but the way you laid it out was great. And even though you kind of realized that you didn't need the second half, I didn't think that was a drawback at all.
And then one other thing that is important to note is it's really important to practice writing and brainstorming at the same time, because you have to write them down to be able to bucket them and to be able to then go back to them if you need them afterwards. So
that's a really good point. When I was doing brainstorming a lot, you kind of think that it's a little bit more loose than a lot of the other sections, but your interviewer is still watching how you're going to break it down and structure it, and you might need to come back to it. So good point about writing down what you can.
Then moving on to the figure. This one was kind of hard to go through because there was a lot of information at once, so I tried to kind of attack it in piecemeal and understand what it meant. Connecting it to the map, I think, was important to be able to do, and because I had a little geographical knowledge of Washington, I kind of knew to look for that. But that's something to understand, that you could do, Tacoma and Seattle in one trip.
Yep,
so.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that was the main takeaway, was kind of linking these two exhibits and not just diving into this one and then looking at this one and realizing, oh, I just did all this extra work. So you did a really good job about kind of using the two together before you got started with your calculations too much. It's a really good job. Everything was clear and easy to follow. There is a lot of information on the exhibit, so I thought you did a really good job about taking it in and walking me through it, and then asking any questions about things that weren't clear.
Yeah, and going back, I probably would have walked through the whole thing actually before diving into calculations, so I could have done a little better job with that. And then in addition, I think it's important to remember, when you get two figures together, there's probably a reason for it, so see what you can do to link them, because that's really helpful. And then this was okay. It could have been a little tighter, obviously, but it was what it was. Then I guess that kind of pushed directly into the math calculations, which I felt like for me they were okay. They could have been a little bit better, but I'm always looking for round numbers. So like when I see hundreds, I love hundreds. So when it was we were doing 2 trips a week, I could have done 52 weeks, but that would have been really crappy to have to do the math for. So
Yeah.
asking if I can do 50, any way you can assume numbers that are round will be helpful, and just make sure that's okay with the interviewer.
Yeah, and I would say in general, in most cases, you're not going to get really weird numbers to work with. So making that assumption was perfectly fine. Just check with your interviewer what you did, and you can usually round off to make it easier on yourself.
Yeah, if you're getting those numbers, you might want to check to make sure you're right, because
Yeah.
they're normally not that mean to you. Yeah, overall I thought, and then I rounded right here to 150, and that's something that is really critical to be able to do to make life easier on yourself.
Yeah.
And even something like this, it would be excruciating to have to go through and figure out exactly what it was, so rounding is also really helpful there. So I always like to break down, 900 divided by 150, and then 80 divided by 50. That's the easier way to do it mentally. So
Great job. And then just your layout too, I thought was nice, since you knew you were going to be looking at the trips to these 2 different locations, doing a separate column for each one and then doing the same numbers down the page was really easy for me to follow.
Yeah, and it probably would have been helpful to just keep with that and put 60 here and 60 here, which I didn't do, but that would be a point that I could improve going forward.
Sure, minor, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, and then finally, recommendation. If it's legible, you probably can't read it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really good. I think it's always important, even if you get to a conclusion and you're not sure, it kind of could go either way, to pick a way and then to kind of say the biggest risks that you're concerned or that you're worried about if you were to go that route, and some of the next steps. So I think you did a great job. I think in this case you probably could have made the case for either one. So again, just picking one and being deliberate about it and giving your reasoning for that, I thought was really good. Tying it back to a lot of the other things that we had already looked at in the case was really strong. So
yeah, the only thing that I feel like could have been better is on a couple bullet points I rambled a little bit and said a little too much, and so part of the key is being strong and being like pithy with what you're saying.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you're not as confident, you tend to ramble, and I think I did that a
true.
little bit. So
I didn't pick up on it, but yeah, I think that is a good point.
Yeah,
I think your
luckily-
recommendation, you kind of want to keep it as short and sweet as you can, but while still hitting what you want to hit.
Yeah, and if you figure out a number, you probably want your number to be in your recommendation. So I kind of lead with that data typically. So yeah.
Great job.
Thank you. So we'd like to talk a little bit about how you would do this, right? How you would approach
Sure.
it.
So a lot of the times when I'm doing a structure, I'm just kind of thinking of the specific case that we're doing and not so much about buckets that you might read about. So in this case, since the main thing that we're talking about is whether we want to keep the current model or look at the hub and spoke, I just broke that out into 2 separate pieces. And then within each of those, there would be a number of different things that I would want to look at. So for example, under the current model, what's our number of stores? What kind of sales are those stores generating? How are they spread out? What are the kind of costs associated with that? Labor, materials, so on and so on. A lot of the same things that you talked about. What are some of the non-financial characteristics like quality, et cetera? And then how would those be the same or different under the hub and spoke model? So just a different way to think about a lot of the same factors. And then more broadly, above kind of not looking at this kind of specific situation, but just get a general sense of kind of the company and its customers. So what are their key products? How do they differentiate themselves? Get a little bit more detail on the expansion.
So make the buckets first
so
and then ask.
That's usually what I would do, is kind of break it down how I think it would look without going too far into the numbers.
Okay.
Get a gut check on whether I think I'm going down the wrong path, so I don't spend a lot of time doing calculations that I'm not going to need. And then kind of fill it in and actually do the calculations.
What does that typical question look like after you've done the variable cost, fixed cost? Do you say like, does this look like a good way to approach it, or how do you ask
so
that?
I think as I'm looking at this exhibit, I would probably say, okay, so we want to know the total cost of looking at what it's going to take to implement this hub and spoke model. So within that, there are a number of different things that we are going to need to figure out. One is the variable costs of these actual deliveries. One is the upfront, the CapEx costs that we're going to have. Another one might be the fixed costs of these trucks. Are we looking at all of those together? Should I break it down and add those up, or are we kind of focusing on one area? just something like that.
Okay, good.
And then kind of break down each piece again. So within the variable costs, okay, the way I'm thinking about it is our miles per trip are going to be this many miles per round trip. It looks like this is our cost per mile. So the way that I would think about our variable costs on an annual basis would look like this, so on and so on. Just kind of talk them through it. And then once you've done it, especially in this case, since we're looking at Washington and then Oregon, I wouldn't talk through it both times. Once you've done it for one and you've kind of clarified your method, I think it's certainly fair to just carry across to the other comparison piece and just do it the exact same way and not say anything about it necessarily. Yeah. So that's the way.
And remember, your zeros tend to be the same here as here, so that kind of is helpful. If you get it right on one, then you can kind of quickly go through the other ones. So.
Great point. So yeah, a lot of the times multiplying numbers with a lot of zeros can be one of the trickier parts of cases. So you want to gut check that you're looking at the same factor, basically.
Yeah. Good. Are there any general general tips that you'd ask your coaches about, or you give your coaches about math?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So one would be, on this one there weren't too many complicated calculations, but if there are, do them on a spreadsheet and then bring those back to however you've laid out your main problem. And then the other one would be, which wasn't so relevant in this case, was once you find a number that they've been asking for, be able to relate that to the rest of the case and say what it actually means. Is this high? Is it low? What is it?
Yeah, like react
give
to
it
the
some
number.
Context. Yeah.
I think that's good. And then the other thing I would say is practice your math. If you're confident about your math abilities, then you're actually going to be able to think about your structure. But if you're worried about actually getting the numbers right, it's difficult to even get to this point. So make sure that you can do mental math, and once that part becomes easy to you, then you can really focus on structuring your math and on making it look pretty. Because if you can't solve the numbers, then you can't really worry about making it look pretty very well.
Yeah. And another thing too is if you make a mistake, everyone makes mistakes in cases. Don't let it throw you off too much. I'm sure they've heard that, but
but seriously, just laugh at it and just say oh, zeros are the bane of my existence. Let's move on. That type of thing. So.
Yeah. I would say I did practice multiplying numbers with zeros, and a lot of the times I would just not think about the zeros at all. Just multiply the numbers themselves, and then count up the zeros and tack them on at the end. Just to not get confused. And I think just, even if you're good at math, it can be a little bit awkward to do it in front of someone. So you can certainly practice on your own to get yourself more comfortable with it, but also make sure that you're comfortable doing it in front of someone else, because even if you're fine doing it on your own, it's kind of a different animal. So.
Yeah, and I was a 9th grade math teacher before, so I might not be the best example because I had to do it in front of people for 3 years. But one thing that I'm nerdy enough that when I run on treadmills, I do fractions, and I convert decimals to fractions to make sure that I understand what 1/7 is, understand what 1/6 is, all of those fractions that you may be seeing. And if you practice those, and the treadmill is a great place to do it because you just don't have much else to think about, then you can get better with those type of things because you need to be good at decimals and fractions.
Yeah, totally agree. I think a lot of times in cases too, you'll get things where, this would be a 25% savings or something, and the numbers sort of work out that way. So if you're comfortable with kind of looking at things on a percentage basis or something like that, that's definitely helpful. And if you can get to those conclusions a little bit faster, that will work in your favor.
Yeah, exactly.
I hope this helps everyone. Feel free to reach out if you have any other specific questions, but good luck with your case prep.
Yeah, thank you guys.